All right, good afternoon, everyone. I don't know what short straw I drew to get the after lunch special, but I'll try to keep you guys awake, and hopefully we can get some lively discussion going because that's what I like to do. You guys don't know me, my name's Justin Garner. I'm with Engineered Air Balance Company. I'm out of our Houston office, and came up through doing test and balance, and then moved over into commissioning. Been doing this for about 20 years. So I can definitely relate to all the struggles that you guys face on a daily basis. So today we're going to talk about our favorite trade out on projects, the controls person. Do we have any controls guys in the room? They don't want to admit it if they're here. All right, I'm not going to pick on them too bad. In fact, I actually tried to get 3 different controls guys to help give me do this presentation with me because I'm trying to advocate on their behalf. And like any good controls guys, none of them showed up. So I'm sorry, bad joke. So no, but today we're going to try and talk about it from their perspective. We always talk about it from a commissioning provider's perspective and what we're trying to do and what we need to be doing. And there's a good bit of that in this presentation. But the main thing I want to get out of this, I guess I can go ahead and move through into the description here. Main thing we're trying to do today is let's look at the projects from their perspective, right? And if you maybe you haven't been involved early on in projects, hopefully you can glean some of their struggles because it's not just that they don't want to do their jobs. They have a lot of struggles to get systems ready for us to do our jobs as test and balance and commissioning providers. And we really need to be cognizant of that because there's a lot of ways that we can help them be successful, thereby helping ourselves be successful. And so that's really how we want to kind of look at this today. So these are our objectives. We want to understand the construction process that affects the installation and programming of the BAS. We're going to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities between the different trades. And then I'm going to spend a decent amount of time on the ways as commissioning providers we can try to help the controls vendors make our jobs easier. And then finally we'll talk about tab roles as well because I know there are tab providers in the room. I happen to be a tab provider also. And they have a role in this also, as you guys well know. So let's jump off into it. What is the one trade that delays tab and commissioning activities more than any other? Anybody want to just shout it out? All right, I think we all agree on that, right? So what do we do about it? Let's first try to understand what does it take for them to do their job. There's a bunch of different components related to the control system on any given project. And some of the ones that I'm going to look at here are very complex projects, so that's kind of worst case, right? But one of the first things that you've got to understand is they're waiting on a lot of other people. Okay, they have electrical work to do, so they have to coordinate a lot of install with their raceways, panels, things like that, and we're going to talk about that in more detail. But more importantly, they're waiting on the mechanical trades. They're waiting on other folks. Most importantly, and we're going to talk about on the next slide, is they're waiting on architectural finishes just to be able to do things just like everybody else, right? And so we need to be cognizant of that. So one of the first things that they're going to be involved in is really if you're doing BIM coordination. I think most jobs today are doing BIM coordination. I've been to a few BIM coordination meetings and usually the controls guy's not there. Mechanical guy's there. He works for the mechanical guy or she works for the mechanical guy. But the controls guy is rarely in that meeting. But oftentimes we'll get invited to that meeting. So can we speak up on behalf of the controls? Because the mechanical contractor, at least in my area, they typically won't. So just be aware of that. If you have the opportunity to be in that coordination meeting, that's where we can advocate on their behalf, right? Yeah, especially if they can't be there. Installation coordination. How often are these items not spelled out in the design documents? And we'll talk about how we can help with that as we get into the design phase. But most everybody else has their scope laid out in documents. And even in the control shop drawings, a lot of times they don't say specifically where they're going to put these. It takes a coordination effort between the controls vendor and the mechanical contractor, sheet metal contractor, whoever it may be, to go out and spot these locations where they're going to have to put their sensors, right? I mean, we know generally where it's going to be, but there has to be a layer of coordination there between those parties. And they're dependent upon that other party to do what they need to be doing. So how do we help with that as a commissioning provider? Architectural trades. How many times have you heard from a building automation or any other trade, I'm waiting for the GC to build the walls? It happens, right? I've had entire whole projects get wrecked from a schedule standpoint because they forgot to build the right walls in the right sequence. You had different superintendents on different floors or areas of the project that weren't talking to each other, and they were just doing whatever they wanted to do. And they built the mechanical room walls and the IDF room walls last instead of building them first, right? Which is not what you want to do, as we're going to talk about here, right? So we need to make sure that framing for mechanical, electrical, and data rooms are a priority in the schedule. Most good GCs should know this. Most good superintendents should know this, but they don't always think in terms of MEP, right? You get a guy that's really good at concrete, he's thinking about structure, she's thinking about structure. They're not necessarily thinking about walls and how we need to do layouts and framing inside the building to affect a schedule that's going to be probably maybe 2 years down the road, right? So we got to start asking those questions as the commissioning provider, and we'll talk more about that. In-wall rough-in locations, once we get those walls up, the contractor, I mean, they actually have to sit down and they have to say, well, I know a T-stat's got to go in this location, but the electrician's got light switches in that wall too. There may be other low voltage connections in that wall. We've got to make sure that this all gets coordinated. And I say we, this is the controls vendor doing it, but you as the commissioning provider can be asking the questions also, right? How do we help them do their jobs? That's the way we want to look at this. But they've got this coordination effort that's got to happen with wall-mounted sensors, built-in control panels, and then of course we have ceiling layouts. Where are we going to put occupancy sensors? Where are we going to tie into lighting control systems? Talk about that a little bit on the next slide. But those types of things, all those things, they've got to get worked out ahead of time. How many times do you walk out on a project and you have a low voltage electrician that actually is a sub to the controls contractor? There's no PM or foreman for the controls contractor on site, and the electrician's just running pipe everywhere, right? Who's coordinating that effort? It doesn't hurt to ask. Hey guys, who from your organization is making sure these sensors are in the right location, right? Those are the types of things we can do. So, when it comes to low voltage trades, one of the biggest things that I see, especially nowadays, is the integration with the IT backbone. Everything's going to smart buildings, right? So everything's got to have a data drop, or it might be wireless, but it doesn't really matter. At some point, the BAS system in almost every building today has to interface with the IT systems. So what has to happen? How many times have you heard, well, I'm waiting on internet connection so I can load my graphics? Yep, happens all the time, right? So what's the critical path in any schedule? It's going to be your data rooms. I mean, that's what we push with our GCs on the projects we're working on. You got to get your data rooms. You got to get your building enclosure built enough where you can actually build out your data rooms. But you have to get your data rooms built, because you've got to get that stuff going so that everybody else can do what they need. Data drops for BAS panels and equipment. How many times does this get messed up? How many times is this right here not coordinated? The controls guy should be giving that information. Typically it's to the owner to some extent, because they're controlling some of that, at least on a lot of our projects. A lot of the data network is owner provided, but it may be different on yours. But there's got to be a layer of coordination there, and it doesn't hurt as the CXA to ask, can I see your list of data drops? How many data drops are you going to have? Every panel, you're going to have one, you're going to have two. How many data drops are you going to have? Just ask the questions and make sure that they're passing that information along and doing that coordination effort. This is a big one. Open protocol interfaces. BACnet's wonderful, right? In theory it is anyway. When you start actually having to have those systems talk to one another, though, that's a completely different ballgame. And so oftentimes it's very easy, and most of the devices that we deal with nowadays have BACnet capability. They're BACnet compatible. But that still doesn't mean that the Siemens panel is going to talk to the Daikin equipment controller, exactly, right? I mean, they talk the same language, but the points are completely different, right? So you've still got to have that layer of coordination where somebody says, give me your points list, and the BAS guy's looking, and they've got to sit there and talk, right? And all that should be really coordinated early on in the submittal phase, but how often does that happen? We see it being coordinated at startup sometimes. And so it's one of those where we need to be pushing the controls contractor to be asking those questions. Another one's lighting controls. I got a project right now that's a nightmare from this standpoint. Engineer put one line in the drawings. I'm not going to design engineer. They put one line in the drawings that said lighting control panel shall be BACnet compatible to be controlled by BAS. That was all the direction that was given. How do you work with that? It's caused a lot of problems. So we've got to be cognizant of those guys. Oh, let me go back here. I didn't cover power monitoring. How many of you folks see Modbus connections to electrical equipment? That creates a whole nother set of issues, right? And there's 50 different ways to do that integration. But the main thing is, just like with BACnet devices, you've got to ask the questions up front. You got to say, how are we going to do this? Because that one oftentimes is, electrical equipment and metering shall be provided with a Modbus interface. BAS shall interface via Modbus. And that's it. There's no more direction. There's very little specifications, and they've got to figure it out, right? So we need to be aware of that and be trying to help that situation. All right, so out of these contractors, if I'm the controls contractor, we have the electrical contractor here, the mechanical contractor, the general contractor, and we'll just lump architectural finishes and structure under that person. And then we have the controls electrician. Out of those four trades, who do you think holds up the controls the most? Anybody else? Mechanical? I think the overwhelming consensus in most cases is power, right? So we're going to have a little bit of an electrical lesson today. What does it take to get power to the BAS panels in a project? If I can get my slides to work here. So that's quite a large project, right? That's a one line of a pretty substantial, it's about 600,000 square foot research building. So you can see this is our entire power system. What does it take to be able to energize our BAS panels and our equipment in this facility? Well, let's walk through it real quick. For those of you that are not electrical based, you may learn something today. I hope you do anyway. If I can get my slides to work here. So let's start out where the utility comes in. We've got a lot of work that's got to happen here. This is a 5 kV medium voltage switchgear. And I can tell you that was about 2 weeks worth of coordination just to get that online. So take that. We've got, I can get my stuff to work here. Then we have our emergency power side. We need to be asking the questions. What's going to be on emergency power? Are the BAS panels on emergency power? At what time is that going to be energized? Because oftentimes they are energized separately. You don't necessarily need the generators and the paralleling gear. You can feed it off of normal power. But there's a lot that goes on with this because you've got to understand that control logic. Because later on, when you start trying to switch those ATSs, as you probably well know, if any of you guys do power critical type facilities, there's a lot that can happen in the background with the BAS controls. I apologize. I'm not sure why this is taking so long. Do what now? Yeah, it must be a control thing, right? So this is your penthouse equipment, right? So we had our medium voltage switchgear down in the bottom of the building. Now we're up in the penthouse. Yeah, my controls are lagging. PI loops all over the place. I apologize, guys. There we go. Okay. So we're up in the penthouse. This is very important because we've got to get power, number one, to all of our equipment. Number two, to our controls. And then we've got various other circuits and things that are fed out of this right here. So there's a number of components that have to be energized. We've got ATSs here, we've got switchgear here, we've got distribution panels that are out feeding our equipment, and then we've got panel boards downstream of that, okay? You have different control devices off of every single one of those types of systems, right? We have equipment controllers that are fed directly off of equipment circuiting. We've got control panels that are going to be fed off of panel boards like these guys down here that are out in the space. And then we also have direct, as I'll show you here in just a moment, in this particular building, we had all of our main BAS panels fed off of a central UPS system in the building. So a lot to coordinate there. All right, I'm not going to try to do, there we go. There's our UPS. So we've got to get all these things up and going. So is it any wonder why the controls contractor is always waiting on the electrical contractor? They have a tremendous amount of scope to get completed, right? Trim out, putting in plugs and putting in lights is a very, very small amount of the electrical contractor's scope. And so we need to be cognizant of that as we're going to talk about in some of these later steps when we start looking at schedule and asking the tough questions as the commissioning provider. So let's jump off into what can we do? We've got these phases of the project. Jim McGee will probably get mad at me because I think I used the wrong terminology. Any of you guys, I'll pick on Jim after his presentation this morning. Yeah, he changed these up and I didn't get the memo. So, but we're going to kind of talk about it in terms of these phases of the project and what should we be doing. All right, so the main ways that we as the commissioning providers can help out the controls contractor. The biggest way is in the design phase with reviews and coordination, asking the questions that we're going to talk about here in a minute. The next one is in construction phase reviews, early on, reviews of the schedule, reviews of submittals when they come out, and it's not necessarily the BAS submittal, it's all the other submittals that are typically the issue that the BAS has to tie into, right? And then how do we use our commissioning meetings to help drive the project? Because that's really what we need to be doing, especially early on. So let's break these down. When it comes to design phase elements, the commissioning provider, and I would argue the MEP engineer, really need to be looking at these items, right? We need to be looking at control sequences, schematics, and specifications. Well, we have that on every single project. Yeah, but do we have them on every project that can actually be built, installed? We can write functional tests and we can actually test it and hold somebody accountable. Is that level of detail there? That's what we need to be asking ourselves. And when I say that, I think it's our role, because in my experience, and again, I'm not knocking the design community at all. Typically, though, the commissioning provider brings a lot more controls experience to the table in design reviews than maybe the design professional does, okay? And oftentimes they have to keep things a little vague and things like that because you may not know who the controls provider is going to be on the project. But I find some of the best value that I think we bring during, and I say we collectively as the commissioning providers in the industry, bring is when we sit in that design review meeting, we ask the questions of Mr. or Mrs. Engineer, what do you want this to do? What is your design intent for this sequence? Okay, let's break down these elements and let's say, how are we going to get there, right? And do we have everything in the drawings, in the documents that we need to clearly communicate this, number one, on bid day, but more importantly, from a functionality standpoint, when it goes out in the field? Well, that gets to this right here as well. Owner's operational requirements. If everybody on the design team, we preach the OPR, that's the cornerstone of the ASHRAE process, but do we truly understand the owner's operational requirements? Are we reflecting that, or did we just copy and paste from the last job, right? I see a lot of copying and pasting, unfortunately. But we really need to be evaluating this as a commissioning provider as far as, are we really thinking about this, especially early on in the design? And then integrations with other divisions and trades. I can't tell you how many times we worked really, really hard and got the BAS drawings, specs, everything to a T. And we had the hardest time trying to tie to a med gas skid to get an alarm. We spent more hours trying to get a little small alarm off of a random piece of equipment because we didn't spend the time early on asking the simple questions and the specs to try and get that alarm tied in, right? We need to be thinking about all those things. Anywhere that there are integrations between divisions, I don't know about you guys, but in my area, and again, I'm not knocking the designers, it's just a simple fact of life. The electrical department's on that side of the building, and the mechanical department's on that side of the building, and there's a no man's land in the middle. It seems like they don't talk at all sometimes, right? And I know that's not the case, but there's so many things that don't get coordinated between the two. And so that's from a commissioning provider standpoint, at least in our company, that's where we're looking to try and fill those voids, right? And ask those questions, because I don't think it's that they don't have the intent for it to be that way, but they're focused on the elements that a designer focuses on, right? They're not always focused on these integrations. They know what they want it to do. If you ask the question and say, what did you want this to do? They'll tell you. It's just not always clearly communicated in the documents, right? And then equipment accessibility for testing and maintenance. At the point of the design documents, no one's typically thinking about how am I going to maintain this, and we really need to. We had some really good discussions this morning about sustainability and about keeping these buildings going. We can have the best designed building in the world. We can commission it to the nth degree. We can turn it over and the owner can absolutely wreck it, okay? So how do we maintain the building? How do we train those owners? But that's a completely separate topic, right? We're talking about controls today. But how do we make it where the owner can continue the performance of day one throughout the life of the building? That's really what we need to be thinking about. And a lot of that has to do with control systems as well. So some common oversights that we see, and again, we're sitting in a design phase meeting here. Who's not in that meeting? I should have said this on the last slide. The controls guy's not in the meeting, right? Who's going to speak up for the controls guy? We have to, right? It's more than likely the design engineer is going to do what they can, but they may not know what we know, right? So some of the common things that we see that get overlooked in design documents are averaging versus single point sensors, especially when you start talking about doing coil controls, okay? Equipment status monitoring. I can't tell you how many times a design engineer thinks one thing and the owner thinks something completely different, right? You ask the person that's got to maintain or operate the building what they want and what the design engineer thinks they need. That's two completely different conversations, right? Safeties are usually pretty consistent, and oftentimes the design professional is going to tell you what they think they want. But control and isolation dampers and valves are usually, yeah, we need that. Figure out a place to put it in the system. Well, figure out a place in the system means more than likely we're going to have a delay later on because somebody's going to forget to coordinate that, right? So how do we do that in the drawings early on? Pressure sensor quantity and locations, and variable speed control. Variable speed control is not as much of an issue nowadays, but we still see issues, as I'm going to show you here in this next slide. So what's wrong with this picture? We'll have a little fun with this one. This fan right here is supposed to modulate to control outside air, but it's not spec'd out as a modulating fan. Single speed fan. How's that going to work? We're supposed to, according to this owner, you guys wouldn't know this, but this owner doesn't want just MagnaHelix on the filters. They want to be able to monitor those filters in their BAS and have alarming on there. How are you going to do that with that right there? This right here, I live in Houston. Normally open's good on here. That one's good, but my particular owner likes to have a feedback on here. I happen to know that. I know that it's in the OPR, but the design engineer didn't include it. This right here is an averaging sensor. That's good. The only problem is it's in the wrong spot. It should have been back here, right, if you're going to effectively control it. How many of you guys have problems integrating the fire alarm system to the controls, to the mechanical systems in which it's monitoring? I have engineers that do this all the time, and their intent is that the BAS is going to monitor the fire alarm system so that the BAS gets an alarm. Very few smoke detectors, duct-mounted smoke detectors, actually have a contact for that. Usually the fire alarm guy is going to set a separate relay for that, right? So we need to be asking those types of questions here because it's just not, it's not something that's clarified well in this drawing. And then finally, I don't know about you guys, but I don't like bypasses on VAV air handling units, right? That's asking for trouble down the way, especially on a fan array system. Okay. Another one that commonly gets overlooked. And again, I think this is really because, number one, you don't have the controls person at the table. And number two, controls is kind of secondary when it comes to mechanical design. Okay? There's a design intent of how the controls need to work, but many engineers don't know what they want from a specification standpoint. They don't know what's good and they don't know what's bad. That's been my experience, and that's not a fault of their own. They just have probably never had somebody sit down and tell them, hey, this is a good accuracy for a sensor given the current technology, right? I know BAPI and maybe a couple others are exhibitors here. I bet those folks would be happy to sit down with a design engineer and give them good specs, right? But how often does that happen? So we need to be the ones that are looking for some of this right here, because this is stuff that I commonly see that is not addressed in specifications. But it wreaks havoc later on, because in the absence of a specification, what's going to happen? Controls guys got to make an assumption, and we all know what happens when you assume, right? So, and it's typically going to cause problems down the way. And then finally, this one really affects us. Do we and the tab firm have what we need to be able to do our jobs? Do we have the requirements in the specification, number one, and the intent there to be able to hold folks accountable for this when it comes time to get to that point in the project, right? I can't tell you how many times I call a controls vendor and say, hey, look, we're going to need access to your system so we can do test and balance or commissioning or whatever it may be. That's fine, I'll sell you a $2,000 interface. Appreciate you offering that. Unfortunately, I need you to look at the specs because it says you shall provide it, right? So we need to make sure that that's in there. But more importantly, that shouldn't be a gotcha for the controls guy. They should know it up front. They should know the expectation. They need to price it in the job. They need to get paid for it. They don't need to charge $2,000 because it's probably only a $200 item for them, but they need to know about it up front, right? So that was design phase. When we get into construction phase, this is very, very important. How many of the folks in the room get invited to early on construction scheduling meetings with the GC, if you're assuming you're on the project that early? That's not nearly enough people in the room. I would encourage you guys, assuming we're following the right process and you're engaged in the design phase of the project, as soon as the construction team is known, right? Assuming they're not brought on early on, and it goes through a bid process and they're selected, one of the first things that you need to do is sit down and do a schedule review. Because it's been my experience, and again, I'm not knocking general contractors, but many of them do not have MEP expertise on their teams. They know how to do concrete, they know how to do finishes, they know how to do site work, they know how to do paint and lay in ceiling tile, but they are seriously lacking in MEP, and they rely on their subs, which is okay, except as long as everybody works together, right? But that's not a good position to be in from a scheduling standpoint when you don't know how to put those items together and coordinate them appropriately. So this is where we can really sit down with them. And we're not just talking about mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. We're talking about those walls. What is your strategy to make sure that you get through that critical path to bring the MEP systems on in a timely fashion? We all want air for your finishes in your building. So let's talk about how we make that happen, right? And then more importantly, let's talk about what that looks like, and we're not just going to turn the system on and let it run wide open. We need to have some automatic control and things like that. So let's talk through the schedule and work our way backwards on how we can achieve that. And then once we know those dates, then we can start filling in some of the blanks, and we kind of know where we're going to be from a commissioning standpoint. And how many of you guys have been given a week to do a 2-month job from a commissioning standpoint? It happens all the time, right? So at least at that point, we can maybe have this conversation 6 months, a year and a half in advance, even though we all know that things are going to slide, but at least we can have the conversation. The next thing, MEP infrastructure coordinations. Are they scheduled dependent upon equipment installation? Or is it just by floor? Or is it by area? We really need to have some logic here, especially when you have multi-storied buildings, vertical risers, things like that. And I would argue that we, as much as we can, need to sit in some of those coordination meetings. I don't know how many of you folks sit in BIM coordination meetings. I don't like sitting in all of them, but at least some of the early on ones and the ones where you're coordinating mechanical spaces and things like that, we need to sit in those. And that's a good time because usually the controls guys we talked about earlier is not going to be there. So we can advocate for that because nobody else is going to speak up on their behalf. Are the utility providers' requirements prioritized? I can't tell you how many projects we work on where everything from an electrical standpoint is installed in the building and the utility company is going to take 8 weeks to get permanent power because the GC didn't check one little box on the form, right? I don't know how, that's the utility providers in my area. Maybe you guys don't have to deal with that. So, and that drives so much as we talked about earlier. And then the data backbone, I can't emphasize that one enough. We need to start talking about that early on. How are we going to get the data up in the building? How are we going to get data connectivity? Not just the rooms built out, not just the racks in the rooms, not just the cable pulled. What does it actually take to get true connectivity for the BAS? And what does the BAS actually need? What can we do with and without that connectivity? We need to have these conversations very, very early on in the project. We're looking at submittals. At this point, well, we're going to make the assumption we get a control submittal. I used to not have to say that, but we have too many projects now where they're very, very late in producing control submittals, and I'm not really sure why. We need to be pushing for that submittal early on. Back in that conversation when we talk about schedule, early on, what's the first thing the GC wants to do? They want to buy out the job, as they call it, right? They want to get all their submittals done, get long lead items ordered, and get everything rolling while they're doing site work and doing concrete and everything else like that early on at the beginning of the project, right? At that point, they go, oh, we don't have to worry about controls. It's a long ways out. And they don't put the pressure on the controls vendor at that point to produce those submittals early. Or if they do, they're just rudimentary submittals, right? They're not necessarily to the detail. And I'm talking about graphics and things like that early on. I say, oh, we'll deal with all that at the end of the project. Well, nothing happens. And then at the time time to start doing functional testing is when we finally start looking at this stuff, right? That's the real world we live in. What do we do to push that up in the process, right? We need to ask about that early on. So when we're looking at those submittals, assuming we get them early on, we're going to go, this is nothing new. You guys should probably know this, but I'll reinforce it. Do the sequences and schematics indicate all the components shown in the contract documents? This is our area of expertise right here, right? Does A equal B? And if it doesn't, are we asking the question why, right? Because sometimes A is a little gray and B is trying to clarify, but we may have known, hopefully we knew the design engineer's intent, and we say, well, you're right, that's one way to look at it, but I don't think that meets the design engineer's intent. So let's have a meeting. We can do a Teams call now, right? Let's get somebody on the phone and let's talk about this early on. Let's not wait till it's installed out in the field and things like that. Going through the bill of material, I think this is one area, at least in my experience, that I can tell you right now when the mechanical engineer reviews the control submittal, they don't care how many sensors are there, right? They're looking at, does this basically look okay? And oftentimes I think they're relying on us as the commissioning providers to do a more in-depth review. But go through this and just make sure everything's there. I can't tell you how many times, we only ordered 5 airflow monitoring stations, and there were 8 in the drawings. And their submittal only showed 5. We missed it, right? Now it's in this day and age, 8 to 12 week lead time to get that item, right? So we don't want to be in that situation. And our termination schedule is included for clear direction to the low voltage electrician. Let's not forget about that person. They've got to run all the pipe, they've got to pull all the wire, and oftentimes they are one of those trades that you're waiting on, right? But do they have clear direction? I have a project right now that all of the wire was pulled, everything was terminated, and we still didn't have control drawings. Fortunately, it was a small project, but they just figured it out in the field and then did their drawings to match what they did in the field. That's not the way it should be done, right? So when we're having our regular commissioning meetings, as I said before, early construction, what should we be doing? Assisting with MEP and controls coordination. They're going to have separate coordination meetings when we go through the BIM models. But when we're sitting in our regular commissioning meetings, what do we need to be doing? We need to be asking, hey, what's the status of this item? What's it going to take to get this system online? This system, this item, this piece of equipment, this piece of equipment and this piece of equipment are all part of this system? Are we looking at all these together, right? Following up on that schedule review that we did before. A lot of times early on, the contractors don't really see a value in having a commissioning meeting, but there's a tremendous amount of value in having these meetings early on. It's how are we going to get from point A to point B to point C, which is ultimately getting us to a point where we can test the systems, right? And then, hopefully they're constantly updating their schedule, but in my opinion, or experience, they don't typically do that. Does the field progress match the schedule? How often do we have a schedule that says one thing, and we, who've been doing this a while, walk out in the field and we look at it and say, there's no way you're going to make that date. I'm sorry. I've been doing this too long, right? I don't care who you put in here. Because past performance is a good indicator of future performance, right? And you're way behind, right? So we need to be having those conversations in the meetings. Submittal status, if we're early on and in coordination meetings, we don't need to get into the details in the commissioning meeting, but we need to make sure they're happening. We need to make sure we're in the loop, hopefully. And things are moving the way they should be, because honestly, the GCs, unless they have a dedicated MEP team, oftentimes this is left up to us to do this, right? We're the ones that are going to drive all this and hopefully make sure it's right. And then the final item here, I'm seeing more and more where the CA role of the design team, especially the MEP team, is being cut down and cut down and cut down and cut down. It's dwindling down to where they have almost no hours to do anything in the project anymore. But they're needed. So they earmark that time for RFIs, the gotchas that pop up, but they're not really involved in regular communications. They're not, they're already on to the next project that they're designing in most cases, right? We need to be willing to pull them back in. We need to be the voice that says, listen, when we need to have a design team at the table, Mr. Architect, you got to bring them in, right? Mr. Owner, yeah, you're going to have to pay them a few hours, but get them here because there's going to be things that need to be clarified, right? And it's a heck of a lot easier to clarify it then write the RFI where everybody knows what the response is going to be and push it through, right? And just send an RFI and say they'll deal with it, right? That's the right way to handle it. All right. How many folks in here write their functional test and send them out to the whole project team to review? Okay, good. I think that's what we should be doing. That's my opinion. I've had good luck doing it. I've met a few providers, though, that say, oh, that's my proprietary information. Nobody gets to see it until functional test day. I don't think we need to have that attitude because there's a lot of surprises and gotchas and means of interpretation, right? You see it one way, they see it another. We need to be getting it out there where they can all look at it, right? And then use the submittal process, use our commissioning team meetings, get the controls contractor in the meeting, and sort through these issues. Make sure that they're reading them. Make sure it's not just getting buried with the mechanical and the mechanical saying, yeah, we're good with it, right? Make sure that the person that's going to be sitting out there with you doing the testing has read it and understands it. Sometimes that requires a direct phone call. But solicit input from those folks. I can't tell you how many times we've interpreted something that maybe, a particular piece of equipment or technology that we had never really worked on. We wrote the test one way because that's how we thought it was going to work. We show it to the electrician or the plumber, or maybe it's the mechanic or the controls guy, and they go, that's not even the way it works. Equipment vendor says, it won't even do that. I don't know where you got that from, right? It's not really what you want to hear, but I'd rather hear it now than the day we showed up to do the functional test, right? So let's ask those questions. Again, engage the MEP design team when it's needed. And then I can't emphasize this last one enough. Bring in equipment vendors. They sold the equipment. They're the factory. They know what it can do, and oftentimes, as we'll note later on, they're the ones that have to start up the equipment and help the BAS guy, especially on those tricky backnet integrations, right? So we need to engage them early on. We need to go to them for answers. All right, we're all the way into construction phase. What should we be talking about in our meetings, especially with respect to controls? Installation and coordination issues. How many times do you guys sit in a meeting and the subs don't want to say anything because they don't want to get yelled at by the general contractor, right? Happens all the time. They got a mouthful of stuff to say and they're not going to say a word, right? But if you go talk to them after the meeting and say, well, what about this? Oh, they'll give you an earful. They'll talk your ear off for an hour, right? We've got to be the voice of reason. We've got to ask those questions and push those answers. There's the old adage out there that a good attorney never asks a question that they already know the answer to. Well, you've got to do that sometimes. Just to get it out on the table, just to get it in the meeting minutes, and advocate for the folks who can't always step up. And a lot of times that's the controls contractor. They're buried sometimes multiple layers deep. Open protocol interfaces. If we haven't worked it out yet, now's the time to do it, right? Keep asking until everybody's clear exactly how we're going to do these different things. Sometimes it takes later on in the project to get some information from the owner, from their operations team about what do they want. A device may have 2,000 backnet points. Well, we don't necessarily need all those 2,000 backnet points. The owner really only needs 20 of them. Let's get those defined, right? And that's typically not in the control submittal. We could ask that early on, but sometimes it's not even known at that point, right? I didn't address the fact that in the submittal process, sometimes you get piece of equipment A 6 months before you get piece of equipment B, and the two tie together. And at some point, you got to go through and look and see, do those things even work? It's that's a big challenge from our standpoint. So this is the time to sort out any of those issues. Pre-startup testing, anything that we're going to do there. I'm talking about like pressure testing and things of that nature, right? I mean, it runs the gamut. But when it comes to controls, what do we have to do to get that equipment online? And then again, I mentioned it earlier, what's going to happen when we actually do startup? Are we going to leave it in hand? Are we going to just crack the chill water valve open and hope that it controls? Or is it going to rain in the building, right? If we're tying into an existing plant, are we going to wreck that plant's delta T? That happens all the time, right? So those are the types of things we need to be coordinating. Out in the field, we need to actually be walking job sites. I know there's a lot of folks probably in this room that you have to travel to sites, right? And I can't even begin to, we do a lot of work locally, right? So I don't know how you do this effectively, other than billing in a lot of travel, and hopefully you can sell that value to your client. But there's a lot to be said about putting your eyes on the job, seeing where things are, and seeing if the information you're being given in commissioning meetings is accurate, right? Because it's oftentimes not that people lie. It's that someone misunderstood and told someone one thing, and they took it another way and then passed along an information. We were kids, we would start from one side of the circle and pass a message around, and it was completely different. I truly believe that that's what happened. I don't like to think that people lie to me, because it really makes me mad when they do. But I try to give them the benefit of the doubt, but this is the way we get around this. We get out there, and oftentimes we can say, hey, I saw that this isn't wired. Got a project right now that's going on. Mechanical contractor swore to me that a fan was installed and wired up and ready for startup. It's not there. I told him, you need to come out here because it's not there. Come show me where I'm missing, because I can't find it, right? So have those conversations. At startup, how many times is the controls guy there during startup? They need to be, especially if they're going to interface with that equipment, right? This picture right up here at the top, this is a factory unit startup guy. You guys may even recognize the type of equipment here. This is a factory guy. This factory guy is really the only guy that can tell the controls guy where to land his backnet MSTP cable and help pull those points in, right? If they've never done this before. There's parameters that need to be programmed in this, and it's this guy's responsibility to do that so that they can ensure communication. If the controls tech is not out there, how are they going to do that? This guy's going to leave. He got paid for one trip to come out and do startup. And when it's time for owner training, it's more than likely not going to be that guy that comes. It's going to be the salesperson that comes, right? That's the world we live in. So we've got to make sure we take care of it here, because if you call that guy back out again, the mechanical contractor is going to want a change order, right? Everybody else live in that world too? Okay. Point to point, you got the drive guy here. That's a VFD right there. This is terminations on a drive. When the VFD startup guy's there, you absolutely have to have the controls guy there. And make sure that they go through and do a point checkout then to make sure it's all working, because again, you're not going to get that startup technician back out there without a fee or a headache, All right, so we're back to what do we do to make sure we can do our jobs, both as test and balance and commissioning. Hopefully we asked early on. Hopefully those spec requirements are there. Hopefully we had a conversation and they said it's no problem, let us know when you need it. But oftentimes that's not the case. What's it going to take to get the software we need to do our job? Is a balancing tool available? How many balancers do we have in the room? A few? Okay. How many of you guys actually like a balancing tool? I don't like them because I can't do everything I want to do. Okay. Cody, did you have something you wanted to say? Yeah. That's one way to look, certainly one way to look at it, right? So I think we need to make sure that we have what we need, and this really, this isn't a tab discussion today, but it's is the tab firm able to do what they really need to do? And a lot of times that involves checking out some of the controls. Do they need full-time support from the controls technician? There's a few vendors out there, even in my area, that it doesn't matter what's in the spec. They will not give out their software. They will not give out computer access. They will say, we will send you a technician. And we'll say, okay, we need them there every day for a month. And they'll go, whoa, that person's only supposed to be there a week. Okay, well, it's going to be a long week. So if you can get them there, right? Are we proficient with the software? Do we need some training? Do we need some support on it? That's another big one. And then what level of access can we get to? Hopefully they don't give us anything where we can really tear something up. It's not that I don't want to be able to do that. I just don't want to get blamed for stuff that other people do, right? Everybody with me on that? Right? Okay. So let's ask those questions. How many times do we get access to a local interface, but we really need access to the graphics, right? And what can we do locally that may be bad that we really could have a little bit more, we could be a little bit more limited and not tear stuff up if we went to the operator's workstation. Again, this is, can you go to the panel or go to the other level? So this is big though. The answers to all this needs to be known before we can start tab and functional testing. Oftentimes you can get this worked out before tab, and then you're going to have the controls contractor there with you when you do functional testing. How many of you folks go through and drive the controls? Controls guy's not around when you do your functional testing. You're on your own. Couple? Okay. By and large, I think most of the time though, you have, at least on bigger projects, okay. So what does the tab firm need to do? They're not completely off the hook here. Let's see how I'm doing on time. When it comes to the controls, the tab firm needs to be communicating with the controls contractor, not only on the items that we just talked about, but more importantly, the tab firm needs to be determining maximum and minimum set points. Static pressure set points for VAV systems, DP set points, or whatever you're going to use to control flow set points on hydronic systems, right? And the way our sequences are going nowadays, that's not just simple set points. They need to be understanding the entire range of operation of the system, and sometimes there's multiple set points that need to be programmed in. So there's a level of coordination there, and if we talk about packaged equipment, then we get back to that startup guy, and we got to know how to go in and put those set points in packaged controllers as well, right? Analyze the design capacity of the equipment versus connected load. Really, usually there's not anybody else looking at this. This is really the tab firm's responsibility. We may do it as commissioning providers. I know my firm does, but we have a tab background. But really kind of looking at what do we have versus what should we have. I'm talking about total grow count versus what the equipment's sized for, to kind of understand diversity in the system. And then understanding set points for all modes of operation, which I kind of touched on earlier. And then this is one, doesn't really tie to the controls. Well, I guess it does tie to the controls contractor. Package controllers, oftentimes it's terminal unit controllers, right? But it can be any kind of package controller. It can be a fan coil unit controller or anything like that. the tab person's going to go through and check that out, or they should be anyway. At the very least, they have to make sure some key parameters are in there. If we're talking about a single duct box, area, coefficient, set points, airflow set points, things like that, right? They need to be documenting that in their report. Oftentimes, they're going to be the last one that changes that coefficient that determines the calibration on that airflow station. That needs to be communicated to the CXA, but more importantly, it needs to be given to the controls contractor also. Because how many times has the controls contractor blown all that information out and had to be reset? It's happened to me, I can't tell you how many times. But I always know that I have the data in my tab report. I can just pull it out, hand it to them, hey, reload these values, we're good to go, right? We don't need to re-go through it. So you guys as the commissioning providers, probably doesn't hurt for you to be looking at that and making sure that that's there as well. And then provide air handling unit performance data for review. And you can ask for a draft report. I can tell you from a tab provider standpoint, if you want to report, Cody and I were having a conversation about this. I can't tell you how many times I used to get asked for a final report. Well, you may not know what a final report really means. That's not something that can be produced very easily by a tab firm mid-project before you do functional testing. They're not finished yet. But what they can give you and what they should give you is draft data. You can either go look at their data, if they're still writing it down on pencil paper, or maybe they can print you out a draft copy if they're using an electronic system. But make sure that it all looks the way it should. Make sure they did their job, right? That's what we should be doing as the commissioning providers. And they should have all that ready to go before functional testing. The most important element, though, is everybody's got to work together as a team. We need to ask the questions, not because we want to be jerks, but mostly because we want to get answers. And we want people thinking. Because I've worked with some really good project teams with some really capable people. And you sit down and you just start asking questions. And then other people ask questions. And it's not that somebody didn't want to give you the information. They just didn't know that that's the information you needed. Or they didn't think it was relevant. So you start opening up those dialogues in your commissioning meetings, early on in design meetings and things like that. People go, oh yeah, didn't think about that. We got to consider that, don't we? Those are the types of conversations we need to have. And that's our role as the commissioning provider. And I think I'm being told I'm almost out of time. All right, any questions? I think we've got about 10 minutes.
Yeah. How do you, in our region, typically, we have rooftop units, and usually the rooftop units are package manufactured, package controls everything. And you mentioned the startup, the control section is not there. But a lot of times the designers are specifying where it's just an enable, disable, and maybe discharge control. And so when you go to test, the specification, the sequence has a economizer and it does all these other things. And the control guy's like, not touching it. Sure. And so we have to get the manufacturer back to do the testing. And sometimes that is absolutely a bear to get them back out. You mentioned that earlier.
I'd like to tell you that, sometimes, especially with certain manufacturers who shall remain nameless today, they don't even want to give you the information to tell you how it should work, right? But yeah, that's one of those that if the design engineer didn't specify those package sequences more importantly, they don't say that it has to be included in the air handling unit submittal, because let's be honest, the air handling unit salesperson doesn't care about controls. They're going to sell a package controller and say, oh yeah, it can do it, right? That's what they do, right? Nothing wrong with them, that's just what they do. And if the spec doesn't say you have to provide the sequences of operation, they're not going to go look at the control spec nor the control drawings. They're looking at the schedules and they're looking at the specs for that unit, and they're going to provide exactly what's there. So going back to that design conversation, we've got to make sure that in the submittal requirements they say any package sequences of operation need to be provided at submittal time, right? And then we need to ask, when we're reviewing the controls submittal versus that submittal, do these two talk to one another, right? How are we going to do this? Yeah, it's all about doing it early on. That's the only way to get around it, because if it happens all the time. I know exactly what you're talking about, right? And if you can't, and that's another thing I can't stress enough, and it happens all the time on electrical equipment, especially emergency power systems. We have all these different submittals from different vendors, and they're all submitted at different times because some of it's long lead, some of it's not. Some of it doesn't come out until the equipment's actually even built, paralleling gear. You don't get the interconnect drawings until they're ready to ship it. At that point, you're scrambling to try and figure out that coordination, right? And so we got to try and work early on to ask those questions and figure out how it's going to happen. That's a good question. Any others? Yeah, Cody.
Apologize, but one of the hurdles we have to clear with the controls, and again, we're kind of advocating for them here, is large corporations that will remain nameless. The protocol just to get on their network is just another layer of hassle. In other words, as far as background checks, just to get a username and password to make the most rudimentary of set point changes. So it's one thing to get on the software, but then and we've been flat denied by network administrators for companies before.
I think at that point, and I'm sure this is probably what you did, you just said, listen, if you won't allow me the access to do it, then I have to have a qualified person either from the owner's team or somebody else that's vetted to be able to do it, right? If you want us to be able to do it as part of our scope, because honestly, it's not our fault, right? And sometimes those conversations are tough, but if they have those protocols and they're going to stick to their guns, so to speak, that's all you can do. That's what I would do. So, anybody else have any solutions to that? Oh, okay. Okay, different question?
Was you had a recommendation that it was the responsibility of the CAD firm to determine the maximum and minimum static pressure set points on an air system. And I'm thinking, is it really the best thing to have them just do that in a vacuum? In other words, like for example, if you're having a schedule for 1.5 inch of external static pressure, and that guy goes out there and he finds he can't get to the flow numbers unless it's set at 3 inches or 2.8, then really some of that comes back to the engineer of record should be consulted or the commissioning provider, right?
I would agree that there is a layer of judgment there that's got to be exercised, right? And yes, obviously at that point, I think you're going to have other issues if it were that extreme, but I understand that's an example, right? Okay. At that point, yeah, there's a layer of prudence there that you've got to go back to the design professional and probably the equipment manufacturer at that point and say, hey, what were we thinking was going to happen here? What can we actually do with this piece of equipment? And at that point, you're looking at a symptom, right? We need to go find the real problem. There's something else wrong in the system, more than likely, right? Yeah. Yeah, and I think that you need to make sure that, I'll speak from an AABC standpoint. I can't speak for NEB and TABB and NBC, the other balancing organizations. But AABC advocates that the tab firm's going to do basic control verification, right? And some of that bleeds over into what you would do on the commissioning front. That's got to be coordinated. That's a separate conversation. What that really means, in my opinion, though, is they need to do what we call a variable volume profile, right? They need to, it's a very defined process where you open up basically drive all the terminal units, if it's an air system, to their max cooling capacity, if that's designed, right? Figure in any diversity that may be in there, and then determine what's the worst case terminal, right? And that's going to determine your set point. You don't want to be much over what you actually need to make that happen. And that's usually where everybody stops. What we argue is that at that point, you need to drive them all to minimum and then reduce that set point down and see what it takes at the minimum. Now, there may not be reset sequences scheduled in the job, but someone could want to do those later on, and it saves time, and it doesn't take any time at all for the balancer to do that. That to me, I like doing it just because I want to see how the system's going to react, right? But it's just good measure to do that, and it helps the commissioning providers. It helps. There's no reason to not do it. There's a lot more good that can come out of it, right? And so in that case, you're following a regimen and procedure. But again, if it's 1.5 inches of static and it's taken 2 inches of supply static to get boxes in control, yeah, we got a bigger issue. Something's wrong, right? And so we need to investigate that. Yep. Any others? Yeah.
Comment. So at the beginning, you asked who slows down the process, and you talked about power. And I wanted to blurt something up, but I knew where you were going. I would say it's the general contractor. And the reason is a lot of these problems that you're talking about are because proper CPM schedules aren't put together. And a lot of these jobs go in and there's 200 entries in the schedule where there should 2,500 entries.
I agree.
In the schedule, because all of these items need to be linked together. And then the other thing we're talking about is the job where it's supposed to be, because nobody's updating that schedule. And the subcontractors are scared to report, because the general contractor says, you have 1 week to do this. Can you do this? And you go, yeah. And I sat in a meeting and I looked at the electrical guy fidgeting. I said, can you really do this in 5 days? And he goes, no. I said, how many days do you need? He says, 12. They won't talk. And so, actually, I have an extra scheduler. I have some clients that will pay for this. We use CPM scheduler.
I think that's something we certainly, there's different ways to address that. You're offering it as a service is one way. The other is, yeah, correct. The other is making sure that those requirements are in the general conditions up front, and make sure the expectations are there and clearly spelled out at bid day, right? You want to make sure that the GCs that are going to bid on the project understand, hey, look, the owner's going to want real schedule updates, tied dependence, critical path schedule on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis or whatever it may be, right? And they need to set that expectation up front, because if they don't ask for it, it's not going to happen, right? And then go from there. And then somebody with some knowledge, which is probably us, is going to have to review that schedule and see if it's reasonable, right?
Right, so when you're asking for those clarifications,
Yeah. Sure. And then at that point, when things start sliding and you have that electrician that really needs 12 days, I think that we need to be the one that stands up and goes, listen, 5 days doesn't seem reasonable. And you can sit here and say that, but I can tell you right now, in my experience, you defend that electrician, it's going to take you longer than that. So let's be realistic. And what is this really going to do, right? Yeah. It's all good. Any others? All right.
Well, one of the issues I've seen recently, we're talking about scheduling the project. You're just getting the utility company to land the power in a timely fashion on site so that everything else behind that can actually happen. Well, that's something I've seen in Colorado and especially out in California, where it's like nobody's holding your feet to the fire. So these utility companies just say, yeah, we can't get out there for 6 months. Well, that's 2 months after it opened. And, what can you do about that?
I think at that point, at least in my area, we have problems with it, but it's not that extreme. There are standard lead times, and everybody kind of knows what to expect, although the lead times are kind of ridiculous. But what we need to be doing is asking up front, saying, hey, we know these are standard lead times. You guys happen to actually be working on other projects. Your electrician's talking to the utility provider. They know people over there. And more importantly, especially if you're working for a big owner, the owner is the utility's client, right? And the owner may need to step in and call the utility and say, hey, listen, I'm the one paying you. Let me remind you of that. I understand you're a big utility company, but I'm the one paying you, and I'm following all your rules here, and I reasonably need you to come and do your job, right? And I understand that there's areas of the country where that doesn't matter, and they just say, click, and hang up on them probably, right? But there's bigger problems there, right? I don't know how to get around them. Any others? Yeah.
Kickoff meeting, let's sit down and we start with what's the opening day? When does this have to be done? And back off everything. 3 weeks for commission, we need 2 weeks for test and balance, and so try to set up all those milestone dates.
Absolutely.
And try to keep everybody in line, making sure that we hit those dates.
I think that's a big part of what we need to be doing as commissioning providers is driving schedule, because oftentimes we're the only ones looking at, especially at certain things. I mean, again, the general contractor is usually looking at finishes, they're looking at structure, they're looking at all envelope and all those things, but many of them don't look at MEP. And so who's going to do that? It's got to be us, right? I think we're out of time. So if anybody else has any other questions, come up and grab me. But I appreciate everybody coming in here and not falling asleep on me.